So once again, thank you very much for saying yes and for agreeing to give this lecture. I think that there's rarely or actually nobody in the world so experienced in multilingualism and also living the multilingualism in the Basque Country. So the screen is yours, Jasone, and thank you very much.
Dober Bird here, Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes, good afternoon or good evening. Thank you very much for your invitation to be here today. I mean, and to have the opportunity to share my work with you. Yes, I live in a multilingual area, but nowadays I think that multilingualism is everywhere, and we have it everywhere. I'm very happy. It's a pity I'm not physically in Slovenia, but yeah, I have been to Slovenia twice, and I was also once in a European project that there were researchers from Slovenia, and we also visited some Slovenian schools in Italy near Trieste. Yeah, I really like the idea of sharing my work with you. What I'm going to do now is to share the screen and see if it works well. So let's see. Is it okay?
It is fine. Just continue. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about, let's see if this works now. Oh yeah, okay, it works. I'm going to talk about pedagogical translanguaging, making the most of multilingualism. And the idea, I mean, what I'm talking about, trying to learn languages and to learn content through different languages. And it could be, of course, including the mother tongue, but other languages at school, and also using resources from languages that the students may use at home. And so what I'm going to start with is talking a little bit about the model that we use that is focused on multilingualism. And it is related to the situation of multilingualism today that, as we say, we don't have, at least in Europe, we don't have monolingual societies. We have the spread of English in education. We have the recognition of minority languages, and it's used at school. I mean, I come from an area where I'm now, is the Basque Country. And this is a part of the Basque countries in France, part of the Basque countries in Spain. I'm on the Spanish side, and we have the recognition of minority languages and the way they are used. They are used at the school, and then there is the mobility of the population. We have a lot of changes in the last years, that there is a lot of diversity, a lot more diversity in home languages than what it used to be some years ago. But what is happening in many ways is that we still have hard boundaries at school between languages, hard boundaries between languages. So there is still, in many cases, the belief that only one language has to be taught at a time, that we cannot include anything from other languages, that the ideal situation could be one teacher, one language. We know that it doesn't happen all the time, but that is the idea, that one teacher is identified with one language, no translation, independent syllabuses, or ignore home languages that are not in the curriculum. This is happening in many contexts in Europe. And with focus on multilingualism, we are looking at more in a different perspective. Here we do it with 3 languages, but it can be with more. But it is looking at the relationships between the languages when conducting research, when teaching or assessing different languages. So when conducting research, to say, okay, I may focus on a second language, but I have to be aware that other languages are there, that the trajectories of students nowadays are more complex, and there are other languages. And also, so the idea is to go to have more, what we can say, more soft boundaries, to go towards soft boundaries between languages. Here we can see it a bit again, like we have multilingual speakers, and our students are multilingual we can also call them emergent multilingual. But of course, multilingual doesn't mean that you are 100% the same as a monolingual speaker of each of the languages. That is not the case, but you have resources in different languages. You can communicate in different languages. And sometimes we are talking about the school, so this can be, of course, limited. And but the students have a repertoire, and they have elements from different languages in this repertoire. And all this is taking place, our teaching is taking place in a social context, and there will be important differences there. I mean, for example, I mean, the Basque Country is very small, but still we have places where Basque is the dominant language, and other places where Spanish is the dominant language. So there can be some differences. So the idea of focus on multilingualism is to change what we say from the hard boundaries, the monolingual views, to multilingual views of softer boundaries. So the idea that languages contaminate each other, let's just isolate them completely, goes into languages can also reinforce each other. The aim that we need to be balanced multilinguals. I mean, of course, nowadays we go many times beyond 2 languages, but when it was 2 languages and if you are not a perfect speaker of both, you are not bilingual, but because you have to be balanced. I mean, if you think about this, I mean, we use languages with different people in different ways. And if we use several languages, more than 2, for example, how can we be completely balanced? As I say, I mean, the day for a monolingual is 24 hours, but for a multilingual also. And we may be using different functions and in different ways. And so the idea is more that multilinguals use their languages for these purposes, and then they can be different skills. I mean, it may be that to write a paper, a formal paper is, I mean, I could find that I don't know, I'm so used to writing in English that my English is stronger than other languages in my repertoire. But it may be that then to talk more, I don't know, informally, I may feel more comfortable in other languages. So, and the idea is also that non-existing monolingual societies cannot be the reference. They are non-existing nowadays. So real multilingual societies are more the reference. So this is the view of focusing more on multilingualism. But now let's look at translanguaging. I think it was, yeah. If we look at translanguaging, we see that the origin of translanguaging comes from school and comes from bilingual education, and is bilingual education in Wales, in the UK, where Welsh and English are the medium of instruction. Not, there are different types of school, but it comes from schools where both languages are medium of instruction. And it comes from pedagogy. I mean, it's not something that comes, I don't know, from somebody who's away, whatever. It comes really from Ken Williams, who was, it was his thesis, but it comes from the things he's been observing. And it is the practice of changing, switching the language, mainly the language of the input and the output. Here is an example to see also that it's not exactly all the input is in one language, all the output. Input, we are talking about what the students have to read or watch, if it is a video, listen to, if it is an audio. So that will be the input, and the output will be what they produce, right? If they produce, it can be oral, it can be written. So, for example, this is from Ken Williams' thesis. And here we can see, we don't have to read the text, but it is just to show you what type of example he gives, because many times before I saw this in his thesis, I always thought, okay, the video is in English, and then a summary is in Welsh, or the other way around. But it's more
combinations. So he gives, for example, this example about the Industrial Revolution in England and Wales. And there is A is a picture, B is a text in English, C is a picture, D is a text in English, and E is a text in Welsh. And then one of the exercises, there are different exercises, is
Imagine that you lived in an industrial town during the 19th century, write a diary entry for the 15th July 1845, which I find quite a nice, interesting way to somehow to get the information about what life could be like. And remember to include information about the house, street, and town. In order to complete this task, you need to process in both languages. And what he says, and this is also Louis Johnson Baker, but talking about what he says, is that translanguaging requires a deeper understanding than translating. And this is because it's not only finding parallel words, but processing and relaying meaning and understanding. Okay, we've been working on translanguaging, and translanguaging has become extremely popular. If you go to Google Scholar or whatever, you'll find that there is a translanguaging in so many articles, so many lectures on translanguaging. And now it has become a bit of, we could say, like an umbrella term. And we make this distinction between pedagogical translanguaging and spontaneous translanguaging. Pedagogical translanguaging is an instructional strategies that integrate 2 or more languages, a pedagogic theory and practice. And this is based on the original way of understanding translanguaging in Welsh education. Instructional strategies, it is designed there and we integrate languages because we use more than one language when traditionally, of course, only one language was used in each class. But there is also a spontaneous translanguaging, and this is the reality of bilingual usage in naturally occurring contexts where boundaries between languages are fluid and constantly shifting. I mean, this is when we use elements from different languages and we use them in conversations because we like to do it like that. We think that we communicate better by doing that. I mean, I can see, for example, pedagogical translanguaging. I can design some classes to develop languages and content taught through the medium of languages by using resources from different languages. And I will give some examples because I'm going to focus on pedagogical translanguaging. But when I'm using WhatsApp with my family, for example, I'm using different elements from Basque, Spanish, and English many times. Or I can be speaking English or Basque and then use some terms in the other language or whatever. That's a spontaneous translanguaging. So what we find is that translanguaging is understood in different ways. So if we look at ways, and what I'm going to explain is closer to the way it was understood in Wales in the origin of translanguaging. What Ken Williams did was he was visiting schools and he was trying to identify successful and planned bilingual pedagogical practices, looking at what is working well. And then he defined the characteristics and labeled them as translanguaging, right? I mean, they defined, and then he proposed that they should be used in other places, but they were planned bilingual pedagogical practices. And what we have seen, because the term has been used extensively in the States and is supported by many more publications than the publications from Wales, is, and the best reference is Ofelia Garcia. By the way, she's here in San Sebastian, where I live, and on a visit some years ago. And it's a different point of departure. What she is doing is observe natural and planned bilingual communicative practices in different contexts. In her context, which is New York, and talking mainly about Hispanic speakers in New York who have been living in New York for some time, or their parents immigrated, sometimes the grandparents, and they use what sometimes has been called Spanglish, a mixture of Spanish and English, because they don't use standard Spanish, and of course they have a standard English at school, but it is different from in Spanish and from, I mean, it's using elements from both languages. And what Ophelia is doing is define their characteristics, label them as translanguaging, and propose their legitimization by accepting them at school. So the important point here is that Ofelia Garcia is looking at these practices that use resources from Spanish and English. And the idea is that we don't have to teach only standard languages at school, but we have to recognize, legitimate these practices, even though, of course, she also recognizes that you need to learn English, standard English as well, because if you want to, to go to university or to get for many things, of course, you need it in the States. But it's the idea of recognizing these practices, valuing these practices, so that these Hispanic children are not left behind. That's the main idea, is the legitimization. But that's a different idea from the original way to use translanguaging. So translanguaging, we can see it more as a continuum, because sometimes, of course, you can say this is a spontaneous translanguaging, but perhaps from a spontaneous, you can learn something, or the teacher, some students may use a spontaneous translanguaging, and the teacher may give some pedagogical value to that by giving examples, or by checking how it could be in a different way. And the pedagogical can also include, of course, some uses of the language that are more spontaneous. But I'm going to focus on pedagogical translanguaging here today. And we can define pedagogical translanguaging. I want to go backwards. Yes, I can. Pedagogical translanguaging as planned by the teacher, as we have said, inside the classroom. And it can refer to the use of different languages for the input and the output, or to, that was the way it was in Wales, but also to other planned strategies based on the use of students' resources from the whole linguistic repertoire. So it's not only based on not only input and output, but using the other languages for other strategies as well. We can see some core characteristics of pedagogical translanguaging. The idea is that the program is multilingual education, bilingual, multilingual, it can be. I mean, you know that in the past, well, the clear distinction could be bilingual is when two languages are involved, and multilingual more than two. But nowadays, multilingual is used a lot more than bilingual, even if there are only two languages. And also second or additional language education. The type of a student is multilingual, or is going to become multilingual by learning the languages. The aims, linguistic, but also academic development, not only languages, but also academic, because we know that there are more and more students who learn content through the medium of a second or additional language. I mean, in my context, Basque is used as the medium of instruction mainly, not only Basque, also Spanish, but Basque is a minority language. So many speakers of Spanish as a first language are learning through the medium of Basque, and speakers of other languages as well. But on top of this, we also have English, and with CLIL programs as an additional language of instruction for one or two subjects in some cases. I mean, not all schools. So we have so many students who are learning not only language, but also academic development is through the medium of other languages. The organization is that it is planned, it is designed, and it is, the approach is that is multilingual heteroglossic. I mean, we're talking about not having the native speaker of each of all the languages as an only model. We look more at the way multilingual speakers communicate. So how can we use pedagogical translanguaging? We can use pedagogical translanguaging to enhance metalinguistic awareness. And when we talk about metalinguistic awareness, we are talking about reflecting about language and how languages work. So students can use two or more languages in the same class and focus on analyzing and reflecting on languages cross-linguistically, and to be aware of the whole linguistic repertoire, to be aware of the possibilities they have, that they can use some possibilities. So we have and this can be done at different levels: phonetics, lexicon, morphology, syntax, pragmatics, discourse, with different skills. I mean, with reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And it is linked to the Welsh concept of translanguaging, but includes a wider range of pedagogical practices. And it can also go beyond 2 languages into 3 or more languages. And I'm going to give some examples, because it goes more into reflecting about the language than the Welsh original concept. So, for example, if we have a class where it can be clear through the medium of English about climate change, one of the things we do is check here which words you could find in other languages that you know as well. So, for example, climate, it can be clima in Spanish, and is clima in Basque. Basque, by the way, is a language that, even though we have these words here like clima and continent, continente, that is the same in Spanish and Basque, is with a K instead of the C. But Basque is a language that its origin is not related to Spanish, but of course many centuries of contact, right? And also the influence that you have with, you have a lot of influence from Latin words, and also Latin words that have gone into English, French words that have gone into English. So you get a lot of that. There are many common words, and mainly when in CLIL programs, when you are teaching science, for example. So what is kind of, do I know these words also? Can they help me? Can I recognize them when they are used differently in another language? And I wanted to show you that even if Basque is quite different, and I'll show you, this is about the cycle of water, okay? And it's quite different from Spanish. Sometimes you don't see it so much. Some tourists who come here, sometimes they say, well, I don't recognize it so well because we have the similar vowels, but the Spanish people only understand words here and there. But if we look at science, for example, the words that are in green here, they are words that could be identified and linked to Spanish words. So that is the idea that when we have a Spanish L1, a Spanish as a home language student, we can have, we can say, okay, when you understand this, you have to realize also that you already know some of these words, that you can, that not everything is new. But we have been working with this, and we have been working, for example, in primary school with compounds in 3 languages, in Basque, Spanish, and English. And what we do is we see how the compounds, and this is interesting that Basque and English that are not in theory related, they have the same structure, while Spanish is what is usually called a false friend, because a bookshop is librería, not library. Okay, that is of course the same word as library, but the meaning in Spanish is bookshop. So what we have been doing, for example, has been looking at linguistic landscape in the 3 languages, and then they write something like, in Spanish is like this, in Basque is like this, in English is like this, but also realizing of how these compounds are formed. But it's not only, we have also worked with the linguistic landscape in a different way, that children have been taking pictures of their town, but then they realize, here we do at the same time language awareness about what the role of the languages is, how they, what they are, like how many languages are there, to which languages, which is the order, does it say the same? But then we go into more meta-linguistic, like, can you divide this word into 2 parts, peluquería, and can you do it in Basque also? And then you have to divide it into 3 in Basque, because these are compounds, or hairdresser in English, and how many parts can you divide it into, but to realize that if they find hairdressers, they could still think this is perhaps it's a compound, perhaps I know part of the word. So reflecting by comparing and using the languages. But not only at the lexical level, we also work at the narrative, writing a narrative text. And here what's happening in our context that we have at least 3 languages for everybody, sometimes also French as an optional subject in secondary school. But what we have is that children are given instructions perhaps to write something. The instructions are slightly different because there are different teachers, they have different textbooks, and in each language they may be given how do you write a narrative text, and then they are given instructions that are slightly different. I mean, if you take 2 textbooks, they don't give you exactly the same instructions. So all this, and then perhaps they are working with telling a story, a narrative text, in October in one language, in May in another language. They don't remember what they learned in one language. We are working with the 3 languages on this. So for example, here on the left is in Basque, and then it is like the different elements. And then here we can see that on the left, they have been working on Basque. This is about description, the other one was narrative, but then they write a description in English. Of course, the levels are not the same in the different languages, but still you can have a shorter description, you can have a less elaborate description, but if you work with the 3 languages at the same time, then you can have, I mean, you can use the resources, and many of these things are common to the 3 languages in our context. The elements that a description must have or a narrative text must have are the same in the 3 languages. So we, for example, we also, this is another example of how the beginning or the end of telling a story, how it is, and then we see, okay, but we do it in different languages, we do it this way, and then we compare at the discourse level. So it can be done at different levels, and we work quite a lot with vocabulary and discourse, a bit also with grammar, but is not so much with phonetics yet. See. But we can see also another way to use pedagogical translanguaging, which is this is closer to the Welsh example of using the whole multilingual repertoire, and I'm going to show you some examples of this. And it is that, for example, this was students encouraged to use 2 or more languages in the same class to carry out different activities, to find sources in different languages. This is also a good thing about this, that you can find more sources if you can find them in different languages, change languages of the input and the output. So for this is an example. On the left, you see 3 newspapers. The first is in Basque, second in Spanish, and the third is The Guardian in English. So this was an activity that we have been doing, like reading the news in the 3 languages. Students is in secondary, students work in groups, and they identify not only reading what's happening, but also identifying like the structure of articles. If it's similar, if you have a headline, and then how you can find a structure of the type of text that newspaper articles are. And some students do it in Basque, some in Spanish, some in English. They exchange, they're working in groups. There are some oral summaries after this in Basque. And we pay a lot more attention to Basque than other languages in our context because it's a minority. And then listening to the news in English, for example, it could be combined in different ways. And writing a piece of news, Basque, Spanish, English, there was a student who preferred to do it in Arabic, so that was okay also, and discussion and feedback. So this is like processing in different languages and more like using for the same type of news, right? To discuss in different languages and using resources, but not focusing so much on meta-linguistic awareness, but more like cognitively trying to process, to produce, to process and to produce in the different languages. That goes, but not translation, but more processing in different languages, as we saw. We have some articles on this. We have the first two are more about metalinguistic awareness and talking about cognates and morphology. And the third one gives some examples of how it is implemented in secondary schools, including this example of the newspapers. If we look at students' feedback, this is from primary school, and we were saying, what did you learn with storyteller? That was the name of the unit. Some words come from the same word, and words are similar in Spanish, Basque, and English. This was shocking for them because we hear so many times Basque is different, English different, they are all different. You know, did anything surprise you when you work with 2 or 3 languages at the same time? And it helped me a lot to learn, to read, and to understand. We had very positive feedback. It was a bit shocking for the teachers. Well, they got some training, but it was a bit of how can I devote time to Basque and Spanish in the English class, or to Spanish and English in the Basque class? So, but teachers, for example, talking about secondary, we had some implementation of cognates in the science class, and the feedback from teachers was that more attention was paid to language than in other science classes. Students realized that the knowledge of other languages could help, and students were reading more carefully. This is, of course, one of the main things nowadays is reading, right? That we all read, not only students, we also read. I realize sometimes, I mean, you read a lot of things, but kind of quickly, superficially, and sometimes it happens with emails also, that I say, no, I have to read it carefully to get all the information. But we are, I mean, I see it when I read newspapers, that I'm reading more newspapers than ever, but I never read one newspaper from the beginning to the end, more like headlines quickly, and that's what the students are doing also. So it is a way to concentrate more on talking about cognates or compounds, to concentrate more. And the example of news in the 3 languages, this other example, that using the whole linguistic repertoire, they learn more because they could use the languages together. The teachers say they develop metalinguistic awareness to see how things are said, the same idea of the same type of news, and they realize that languages are not separate compartments. We also have some reflections from teachers, like some teachers that were asked about this, and they said it's necessary to make students think of what they previously know about a topic, because their input is always positive, not only for themselves, but also for the rest of the class. I think that this is an important idea of linking what they already know to what's new, what's going to learn, and then what they are going to learn. And another reflection is that when students are given the opportunity to provide the information they have to give to their classmates and teachers, it increases their self-esteem. They consider themselves important. Well, what we found also, and we were also told by some teachers, is that for some students who perhaps were not that good, for example, in English, but they could identify some of the words or related to something they knew better in Spanish or Basque, and that made them more confident. So that's another thing. But let's look a bit at some more final remarks and thinking about what is pedagogical translanguaging. One of the main things that I have already mentioned is this idea of linking prior knowledge to new knowledge, and by benefiting from multilingual resources. I mean, the idea is that we know more because we know several languages. It's not, and so we can benefit if we use our previous knowledge, the knowledge we have already, and we use it. We use it for, we use it when we are learning other languages or content. Pedagogical translanguaging reinforces language and content learning by integrating core academic language skills across the curriculum. This is an important aspect, mainly if we are teaching through the medium of another language. So what it means is that one thing is to have some basic communication skills, what already for a long time you may have heard of Cummings making a distinction between BICS and CALP. BICS has basic interpersonal communication skills and CALP cognitive academic language proficiency. He's a researcher originally from Ireland, but living in Toronto, working in Canada all his life almost, and talking about immigrant students, said they can manage in English quite well, but when it comes to academic skills, to the type of language that you use in textbooks or in pedagogical videos or by the teacher in class, then there are words that are more complex, there are structures, there is nominalization, the terms, everything is different, and then they have more problems. So what you can work quite well with pedagogical translanguaging is working on these academic language skills. This term, core academic language skills, is from another group of researchers with Paola Uzzelli from Harvard University and her associates, and they have developed quite a bit. What can that be? And there are many things that you can do, and they talk about doing it cross-linguistically also. Cummings also says that there is in this book that he published at the end of last year, he says the legitimacy of pedagogical translanguaging is supported by extensive research evidence demonstrating that mobilizing students' multilingual and multimodal repertoires can scaffold students' L2 learning and their understanding of L2 academic content. So it's both, is supported, the legitimacy of doing this is supported by research, and it will have an effect not only on language, but also on academic content. So what we are doing and working with, and we have seen this with a focus on multilingualism at the beginning, but the idea is to work, of course, there are many parts of the language that are not the same in different languages, but to use the resources that can already be there, and they can be represented here with the connections, the part that is overlapping, and which can be quite substantial. It doesn't mean that everything has to be translanguaging, but is that we can include and we can use translanguaging. So the idea, and going back to the soft and hard boundaries between languages, is the idea of focusing on multilingualism to develop pedagogies that consider the speaker as multilingual, the multilingual repertoire and the social context. The idea is, it's not the speaker, the learner is not a deficient student who will never reach the level of a perfect native speaker and will always be limited. No, it's not, that's not the idea. That first, the native speaker, if the native speaker is just monolingual, it should not be admired as a native speaker, because it's not a multilingual speaker. Okay, and then of course the student has all these resources that can be used. So the idea would be to replace hard boundaries by soft boundaries between languages. Of course, there is nowadays a big debate, mainly in the States and related to translanguaging, about languages. There are, I would say, some quite influential in the studies on translanguaging, scholars who say that languages don't exist, that they only look at practices. Let's say they go, against standard languages. But of course, at the same time, standard languages are used at the school, they are used for any type of evaluation and so on. But so what we work and what we do is, okay, we don't go against the existence of languages, but we want the boundaries to be a bit softer than what they have traditionally been. But at the same time, of course, it's necessary to provide what we call breathing spaces for the L2, L3, L4, and the language of instruction. I mean, whatever the language of instruction of the, so that means not everything can be translanguaging. And we need breathing spaces. For example, in our case, that Basque is a minority language. What we want is that there are spaces at school where only Basque is used. And that is necessary also. I mean, we don't have much exposure to English either. So you can say, okay, but we are going to use English only here. And it's not that everything has to be translanguaging. These languages also need their space. And another thing that we have seen, and this has come more from practice, I would say, is that pedagogical translanguaging needs to be introduced gradually, and it has to be adapted to existing school pedagogies. I mean, it cannot be, I mean, where our teachers are used to having one language. They have mainly, I would say, yeah, but also with Basque teachers, Basque language teachers to protect Basque, and English language teachers have been told kind of, do not use other languages, do not translate. So it is already a bit shocking to be working this way, and you have to work, of course, with all the language teachers at the same time, and also coordinating with content teachers. But it has to be introduced gradually, and the implementation of pedagogical translanguaging needs to be tailor-made for specific contexts, and taking into account the languages used in the wider social context and the aims regarding multilingual competencies. So, for example, if you need to work harder on a language that students have less exposure to, or if it is one language that is the content, the language, the main language of instruction, you may say, well, I want my students to know this very well. They can learn it in other languages, but we have to work depending on the context. That's why it has to be tailor-made. And well, I wanted to show you some other articles that we have. Most of them are open access, not all, but if you need any, you tell us, because it depends a bit, depends on the funding we had at each time for the open access. And so about minority language, then there is a special issue of pedagogical translanguaging edited with Dorgorter. And then we have also from our group different articles with them about anxiety, the perceptions of anxiety when you use pedagogical translanguaging, and how to use it more in language classes. And the one that is also an open access is this small book, I would say is a very short book. And you can go to Cambridge Elements is the collection, and pedagogical translanguaging, and you can download the book. I can also show you, if you want to see a bit about pedagogical translanguaging and the children in the Basque school, one of the Basque schools where we implemented this, you can go to YouTube, and if you write, let's make the most of multilingualism, you will find this video. We have it in Basque and in English. Well, this is the English version. And I think that's all for the time being, waiting for your questions.
Thank you very much, Jasone. So hvala. And I can't also pronounce the Basque version, so maybe it would be nice to hear the Basque version of saying thank you.
Well, eskerrik asko, that's easier for me than hvala.
Okay, thank you.
Eskerrik asko.
So thank you very much, for this very informative and very interesting talk. We already have a question in the chat from Pia, our colleague. So because we've been running, here a project called Languages Matter for 6 years now, and there are many of teachers so in this group have been working, with let's say multilingual or plurilingual approach. And one question is, what is the difference between pedagogical translanguaging and plurilingual approach?
Yeah, a plurilingual, what we work, I mean, it is of course in the same, it goes in the same direction, right? I mean, we are using, what we are doing is working with, I see with a plurilingual approach. I mean, we can say they can be many things in common between the two. We are working on the use of the languages, the whole linguistic repertoire, but we are working like with exercises with these languages. What I have seen, plurilingual approach is the focus more on language awareness than on meta-linguistic awareness. Is my idea, but more the focus. I mean, I don't say that it's completely different. We use the term translanguaging because it comes originally from, I mean, it's the origin of the term translanguaging that we are using for planned strategies using resources from several languages.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, please? You're welcome to ask anything you might be wondering. Okay, maybe then I can ask a question and then give some time others to come up with a question. So one question that has been kind of bothering me, okay, for some time is, what should be the level of language proficiency, so of the students, where you can say that pedagogical translanguaging can really work? What I mean here, can you say that pedagogical translanguaging is, let's say, more or less efficient or more or less suitable for learners who are, I don't know, at this beginner level, so A1, A2 level, or, you know, on the other hand, C1, C2 level, or language proficiency does not really matter?
Well, I think that the levels are, we have been implementing pedagogical translanguaging with, at the end of primary education in the 5th and 6th year, and also in secondary education. Mm-hmm. And the levels that we have are different in the different languages. I mean, of course, but the weakest is usually English. The third language is usually the weakest because most of the students have learned content through the medium of Basque, even if they speak it more or less, and they are all fluent in Spanish. So it has been, we have seen that even in primary, for example, that the level of English was not very high, and they could benefit quite a lot from the knowledge of Basque and Spanish when learning English, and the level was not high. And we have seen, and in secondary, of course, I mean, one of the things that we are also working with now is that because many students with Spanish as a first language, the majority language, Spanish as a first language, learn through the medium of Basque. We see that the more, because this has been changing, before there were not as many, but it has become more and more popular. But at the same time, I mean, what can be a kind of success for the minority language, because it's a language that is a minority and parents choose to learn choose the language of instruction, and it can be very successful. But at the same time, it's creating new challenges all the time because it's a language. I mean, you have to learn all the content through that language, and then we see it extremely useful for you to work on content. I mean, to work on academic skills in secondary school, in very useful for that.
When they become, let's say, more fluent in all languages.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now have we got some questions? Come on, don't be shy. Alma, come on.
Yes. Good evening to everybody. Hello. Thank you very much for the interesting talk about translanguaging and multilingualism. Once again, a really important topic. My question though is, I work with university students and I work also in teacher education. So it's very interesting to hear about pedagogical translanguaging and the methods that we can use in class. But I also teach language-based courses. And my question is now, I'm not quite sure how limited maybe translanguaging is in this university context. Would you say that it could be a little bit limiting in the sense that how much could we use it for this formal assessment of students? Could there be some interference? So these are just some of the questions that I was thinking about while listening to the talk. Although it seems like a very interesting approach that could be really useful, I'm not quite sure how it can facilitate some of the methods that we're supposed to use with university students in the sense of preparing them for these, for example, professional contexts and translation in particular. Applying translanguaging could be incomprehensible, leads to maybe some incomprehensible translations, or could there be some interference there? So have there been any studies that were dealing with maybe some of these questions?
Yeah, and you mean, Alma, you are talking about teaching, you are teaching, but teaching English or Slovenian or what?
English, yes.
Teaching English at university.
English, yes, in a non-English country, a non-English speaking country in Bosnia. Where
in Bosnia, okay.
English, yes.
But you are teaching English.
Yes.
So I think that, I mean, there are different ways to work on pedagogical translanguaging. And at university level, what I find that could be useful, for example, is also to work quite a bit at the discourse level. Like if you are working on, I mean, on reading, writing, but at the, I mean, academic text or whatever, to see differences, to compare how it is in the different, in the languages involved, and how you can do it. I mean, how you can reinforce certain things. I mean, that you can say, okay, there is this article in this language, but we want a summary or different types of text in other languages. Another thing that we have done also is more like the input-output differences, but that was to reach, I mean, when teaching through the medium of English at university, and of course in a context where not so many students dare to take a subject in English and all. I mean, it's not like in countries, I mean, we don't have a very high level of English, and it's not like in countries like, I don't know, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, that they manage very well and so on. So one of the things that is, for example, to have input and output to allow students to register in a course in English, but telling them that they don't have to produce anything in English if they don't want to, so that they get the input in English from the teacher, the articles they have to read, or the work they have to do, everything with a bit of support, and then they can, if they can use the first language if they want. We have been working on that, and that more like the input-output more than the meta-linguistic way, okay? More the input-output, and it has worked quite well. I mean, for students to dare to take courses in English, for example, at university. We have done that, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, I think that the question that colleague Daria Metel also wrote in the chat, I think it's similar, but I mean, I don't know if you think you should add something, Jasone. It says, to your knowledge and experience, how much is the translanguaging suitable, present, and or researched within higher education, for example? So this is any language for specific purposes, like Spanish for specific purpose, Italian,
yeah.
or...
I mean, university, we just answered, but for specific purposes, I find it completely interesting in that, because that's where you can work a lot on vocabulary, specific vocabulary, and quite a lot, and also at all levels. And this course is always useful also, but you can work quite a lot on for language for specific purposes, because technical, mainly when you talk about English, technical scientific vocabulary, technical vocabulary can be very similar. And the other thing is that, of course, the way the way you organize, for example, if you have, I don't know, language of tourism or language of science of chemistry or whatever, the way you organize, you will write a report in English or in another European language is quite similar. I mean, it's not the elements of that report are similar, even if the language is not. But so it is more at that more abstract level of the structure. Or, I mean, once we had also another thing that's interesting and that we found quite interesting, I mean, to work with this was, and that we asked the students, these were in secondary, but to write a composition in the 3 languages. There were the stimulus, they had to describe or tell a story about a drawing, but they had 2 weeks between languages and the drawings were different. One was like, well, there were many things that you could do, but it was like a scene of a camping ground. Another one was a house, but like an open house that you could see many activities of what people were doing on each floor and things like that, right? Different ones. And then instead of looking at, the way you would always do is, okay, we see the scores in English, the scores in this, in that. What we did was, let's take the compositions of the same student in the 3 languages, and let's look at what is in common there. That's another, I mean, we did it in 3 languages, it can be done in 2. And then you realize that in many cases, somehow the approach is the same. And that makes sense because it's the same person writing. I mean, if I realize, I mean, if I write my style, writing an email or writing whatever will be similar in different languages. But then you realize, and for example, we had a student who was kind of completely describing the scene like left to right, one of these, you say this, left to right, top to bottom, like everything that was there. Another student who was kind of introducing himself or herself, I don't remember now, in the story somehow, try to introducing other members of his family, whatever, in the 3 languages, even if there were different topics, even if there were 2 weeks apart, that they had to write a language in 1 language only. And then you see, well, the thing is that if there is something that is very useful or something that is very wrong, you can really help better teaching across languages. I mean, that's what we found with that. I mean, that you can, because then you could improve in the 3 languages by doing this, instead of just doing, the English teacher tells you this, the Spanish, and then no coordination. Coordination is, of course, crucial here.
So Daria, colleague, so the same colleague also mentioned, she says, so language for specific purposes, genres, in brackets, awareness about them, are expected already from the students as a sort of entrance level in both languages. Is this so?
Language-specific genres, like, yeah, I think the type of text, I guess, yeah, I mean, to work with different types of texts. Yeah, not, I mean, they can be learning this. It doesn't have to be that you expect it before entrance. It depends. I don't know exactly what entrance level, if it refers to specific.
She means, yeah, that they are already able to do it, you see.
Yeah,
so
well, and they can be learning in the 3 languages. Yeah. I mean, by learning by, I mean, by using different types of texts, and they have been, perhaps they have already worked on this in the main language, school language or something, and then to work more in the other languages, but not at the same level. I mean, you can say, for example, you say, well, a text, argumentative text, okay, that you give reasons to defend a position or whatever. Perhaps that can be very rich, and perhaps in our case, in English, in the third language, it's not that easy to have a very elaborate argument because of proficiency, right?
Yeah,
but
that's right. Yeah.
Something like descriptions can be easier than an argumentative text. But you can do it with, even if you give a simple, I mean, that the structure is kind of similar, even if it is a lot more simple in one language than in another, right? I mean, that the structure is, the text will not be the same. It doesn't have to be the same quality in the same level of proficiency in the different languages.
Okay, thank you. May I raise one kind of, I would say, worry or threat that many of my colleagues feel when it comes to translanguaging? And this is, I think that you remember that we are old enough to went through different kinds of, I would say methods, language methods, right? And I don't know, we still remember some of my colleagues that, I don't know, let's say 30, 40 years ago, the languages were taught through translation or just learning certain texts by heart. And now when it comes to, switching languages, I think that well, from my point of view, translanguaging or pedagogical translanguaging should not be understood as, switching languages all the time, but just when you know when to and you have planned. Am I right?
Exactly. I mean, it is not, I mean, there are different, I mean, one thing is to say, I mean, there have been many methods, as you say, Carmen, that's true. And many, I mean, we have had, I mean, for example, there was the time of contrastive analysis, and then we practice everything that is different, drilling or whatever with this audiolingual methods and all that, right?
Yeah.
And just doing it by heart, and just practicing those things that are supposed to be a problem because they are different, even though they were not necessarily a problem, and there was no context. I mean, one thing that is completely, I mean, that is important is that it has to be pedagogical translanguaging. It has to be, the language has to be in a communicative context, obviously. I mean, not just, okay, we do this or we do, that's why we have also, it's very important, for example, to work at the discourse level in that sense, but it gives you more a context in that that is important that it needs a context to have pedagogical translanguaging. We have had, in the other point that you made is more like anybody can talk any language or anything or switch. I mean, that is more like you can use any spontaneous translanguaging or whatever. What it is important is that it's not that anything goes. It is, it has to be planned for a specific purpose. It is not, I mean, you can, and we do have, because we are working on the three with in language classes of the three languages, and we have a base language there. I mean, if it is the English class, for example, all the instructions, they're all in English. There is a base language, and then you have the exercise if needed, but it doesn't mean that you need the exercises of pedagogical translanguaging all the time. I mean, you can have many things that are in English only if it is the English class. I mean, not everything is pedagogical translanguaging. And one thing that is important is that I mean, with all these things, and this happened also with CLIL, with the idea of CLIL, with it has been always, there is this idea of the celebration, something new, something, we have been through a lot of these things. And of course, it is not like, okay, this will solve all the problems we have, or this is, no, it's just using resources to link the whole linguistic repertoire to the new knowledge that has to be acquired to reinforce that the languages reinforce each other, but it doesn't mean, I mean, you need a lot of spaces for one language only. I mean, it cannot be, and I think that, I mean, you can link somehow a spontaneous translanguaging to pedagogical translanguaging. You just say, okay, let me see how you say that, you communicate that, but now let's have that in English only, or in Slovenian only, or Bosnian only, or in Spanish only, or whatever. Let's have it in one language only, or if the focus is on English only, because this is an informal way to communicate, and let's make it at another level. Imagine that this conversation that you have in your WhatsApp or whatever is not, it is for another context, and let's work on it on English only. But it is not, I mean, the idea, it can be different. Translanguaging is understood in different ways. And there is a lot about the legitimization of using resources of spontaneous translanguaging. But you need, I mean, we have worked also a bit with the idea, I mean, with Basque, and that is a minority language. Even though it's used extensively at school, it is still vulnerable. And it is a language that is defined even by the UNESCO as a language at risk because of, I mean, it's only spoken in a small community, and it is not spoken outside that, and it is, I mean, it is, even if you can use it at school, then if students prefer to use Spanish among themselves and all these things. So if you would allow in this context that anything goes, Basque will disappear because it will be the big fish will eat the small fish there. I mean, the Basque would disappear because children, I mean, what is happening is that when they use elements from different languages and whatever, they can still use Spanish without much Basque, I mean, mainly standard Spanish, because they are exposed to standard Spanish all the time. So they can use standard Spanish, but the Basque will be with lots of elements of Spanish. If you accept that, that will, I mean, so that's, we had this article of 2017 in the Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development about this. I mean, that is it a threat or not for this type of situation? And that type of situation in a context like ours, and I don't know your context exactly for English.
Very, very similar,
for English, but you say, well, I mean, if anything goes, and they can, and I accept that the students use any mixture of their language and English in the English class, what are we doing? That's not good for the students to do that. It's only when it has a specific purpose that we use it, not just anything goes. It cannot be like that. From our point of view of pedagogical translanguaging, it is a different point of view. Perhaps if you, I mean, it depends on the context. In the States, they are using that a lot with the Hispanic children not to be left behind, and that's another situation. That's a different situation. I don't say, I mean, what they are doing with that and trying to accept that, and they also say languages don't exist, so only practices, and this practice is as good as other practices. That's a different situation. But of course, it's also a situation of perhaps wishing that it could be like that. But the only thing you find there is that the exams are, I mean, what you find is that exams are in the standard languages, and the standard language, mainly in English. That's also, I mean, when I mean, there have been some about assessment. There is also, we've been discussing assessment with translanguaging and so on. But, and of course, there have been examples of students. For example, Elena Shohami has been reporting on students in Israel, and Russian students, who were given the possibility to use, to have the exam in the two languages and to use, and they got better results. And also Kathleen Hugh about South Africa, with also given more than one language, that they had their own language also, and not only English, and then and then the results were better. They have been working on these things also in about immigrant students. There is a group with Piet van Emert and others in Stephen, I don't remember his last name now, in Belgium. They work with immigrants, and they are talking about accommodating the exams by giving kind of more words, translations, glossaries, whatever, things like that. I mean, that's one thing. And another thing is to say, I mean, that is working better if it's necessary, when it's necessary in some situations, of course.
We also have such an example in our minority region, where, you know, we have a minority, I mean, a bilingual region. What is this, north, south, east of Slovenia, Hungarian, Slovenian, so bilingual area, and they can, they're given instructions in both languages, and they can answer in the language they want to, because they learn both languages at this, you know, at a high level. So yeah, and then they can answer in both languages, so something similar, I think. What you have been talking about. Yeah, I just think that, you know, whenever we have a relatively new approach or a new method in language teaching, it may get misunderstood and not, you know, and does not bring the benefits it could or it should.
Yeah, because there is a kind of the celebration of this, right?
Yes.
I mean, that has happened also, for example, with CLIL. We have had a lot of CLIL in our country, and many times teachers do not have the proficiency to teach subjects through the medium of English. And everybody, we also had the early introduction of English at an early age. Everybody thought, oh, with this, we solve everything. And it is true. We have to be critical at the same time of the shortcomings of things. I mean, not only, I mean, they can be good points, but it has to be, we have to be aware and that it can work better in some contexts than in others. And it has to be integrated into the teaching that exists in that country or in that area.
Thank you very much. Any more questions, ladies? Then I would like to thank you. So thank Jasone. So please stay online. But to all the others, have a nice weekend and see you in 1 week's time. Enjoy, stay healthy, and try to translanguage or try pedagogical translanguaging in your class.